Welcome back to the conversation. Reaction continues to pour in for the prisoner swap with Russia. WNBA star Brittany Griner in exchange for Griner-Bout, who was a Russian arms dealer that was in US custody. Joining us to talk about all of this is David Smith. He's a Washington bureau chief for The Guardian. David, the reaction was so intense initially, but do you have a sense now, a couple days later, in terms of how this is cutting politically?
Sure, I don't think it's going to have a very long legacy. Certainly not negatively for Joe Biden. I mean, you heard some critical Republican voices at first, particularly on the right, Senator Tom Cotton, former National Security Advisor, John Bolton, and so on. But the emotional power of Brittany Griner being back on American soil, being reunited with her wife, and so on, it's hard to argue with. And I think some of Joe Biden's critics, at least, are realizing there's not much mileage in it for them there. And so, on balance, I think it's probably a net positive for Biden. Not everybody agreed with this decision. Clearly, if Griner-Bout turns up involved in nefarious activities again, then that will be a whole different story, and it will be used as a cudgel against Biden. And it's certainly true that he's been given a warm welcome in Russia, and Vladimir Putin is claiming some kind of victory there. But I think even that is probably overshadowed by what's happening in Ukraine and the conflict. So I suspect Joe Biden has no regrets.
Yeah, I mean, the common sense reaction in my view is, okay, this is a complex situation. I mean, everybody's glad that Brittany Griner is back, but of course you wouldn't want to have to give a arms dealer back to the Russians. I wonder if Joe Biden benefited a little bit, because when there was that initial reaction of, oh my goodness, Joe Biden is somehow freeing terrorists, people could immediately go back and say, okay, well, what about those 5,000 Taliban that Donald Trump agreed to free in Afghanistan?
That's right. It's very hard for Trump and his Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and others to lecture the Biden administration on these sort of issues. Trump took a very transactional attitude to foreign policy. Interestingly, he did bring home some hostages, but yes, there's the Taliban. I think other cases too, where he was not really too bothered about the consequences. And so, yeah, it's in terms of preaching an ethical foreign policy and freeing people who should not be freed. I think Biden is not particularly vulnerable on that topic. And conversely, I was at the White House yesterday for the celebration of of Joe Biden signing the Respect for Marriage Act. There was a mention there of he mentioned Brittany Griner and her wife, and it got a huge cheer from the crowd. So I think public sentiment is quite favorable towards this, especially when we see potentially Brittany Griner returning to a basketball court.
Have you picked up much chatter either at the White House or elsewhere in Washington about a Joe Biden 2024 campaign and what that would look like and which way he may be leaning at this point?
Yes, I think the general chatter is leaning towards it happening. Biden himself, when asked on the record, he will say he intends to run, but he's got to discuss it with the First Lady Jill Biden and family. Probably do that over Christmas. A few months ago, when his poll rating was extremely low and the economy was going badly and the outlook for the midterms was bleak, you certainly heard some voices in Washington muttering about a potential challenge or it's time for Biden to step down. I think the midterm elections actually went quite a long way to silencing that. Joe Biden's Democratic Party did much better than expected. It retained the Senate. And when you stop and look at his achievements over the last couple of years, they're fairly considerable in a very tightly divided Congress. The legislation on coronavirus relief, the legislation on climate, bipartisan gun safety, infrastructure, quite a few other things. Some would argue the most since Lyndon Johnson in the 60s. I think Joe Biden's other two big advantages here, and the reason that a lot of people think he will run again despite turning 80, is one, the lack of an obvious heir apparent. There is certainly not a clamor in Washington for Kamala Harris to be the presidential nominee. Pete Buttigieg is probably too young. Bernie Sanders is too old. Lack of other contenders. And then secondly, Donald Trump has already announced he's running again, and if Trump is the Republican nominee, and obviously huge over that, then Biden is seen probably as the safest alternative, having already beaten Trump once in 2020.
The strategy with Donald Trump announcing early, the idea, as I understand it, was to try to rack up some fundraising, endorsements, get his organization going, and essentially have some momentum and clear the field of any Republican challengers. It doesn't really feel like that's happened at all, that Donald Trump hasn't been able to do much fundraising or bank much off of this early announcement. Where does the Trump campaign go from here?
It does seem to have backfired spectacularly. It had the precise reverse effect that Trump hoped. Far from clearing the Republican field, you see Ron DeSantis and others potentially running against him. You don't particularly see much energy. We're not having campaign rallies. I'm sure some money is still trickling in, but not at a huge clip at the moment. So I think Trump probably needs yet another relaunch of sorts. I went to the one at Mar-a-Lago. It was quite lethargic and low energy. His problem is that Republicans who are willing to overlook all the moral compromises and 4 years of chaos at the White House, at least some of them finally seem to be waking up to the pragmatic electoral calculation that he steered the party badly in 2018, 2020, and now 2022. And so just on a ruthless level, the man who claims to be a winner turns out to be a loser. And so we may see some of them at least desert him this time around.
And despite all of those losses, and despite dining at Mar-a-Lago with 2 anti-Semites, and despite saying he wants to terminate the Constitution, there was Michael Steele, a former Republican chair, saying, well, show me the evidence that Donald Trump does not have his sort of grip still over the Republican Party. Steele's argument is that there's a core base of Donald Trump support out there that still makes him perhaps the front runner for the GOP primaries. Do you buy it?
Yes, I definitely understand that point, and I would not dare to predict what's going to happen. On the one hand, he's got all the legal investigations. He's got Republicans doubting his winning ability, but on the other, he's been written off 1,000 times and bounced back. And certainly, I know whenever I go to a Trump campaign rally, it gives me food for thought. I see the fanatical, fervent base. They arrive at 7 in the morning. They'll stand there through blazing sunshine, through rain. They still love this guy, and so Trump has that core support going into a primary. He should definitely not be written off once he starts hurling insults at DeSantis and others that could have influence. And I think the broader point here is that even if Donald Trump loses, Trumpism is still alive and well. Somebody else speaking to the Lincoln Project said this primary is probably going to be a choice between Trump and Diet Trump. So even if the man himself fades, I think you'll see DeSantis and others trying to copy his style and substance. And what we're not seeing is a return to the Republican Party of George H.W. Bush, John McCain, John Kasich, or indeed Liz Cheney.
In January, Washington will be returning to a divided government. Democrats in some fashion will control what happens in the US Senate. Republicans will control the House, it seems. Of course, Joe Biden in the White House. With this sort of tightly sort of wound divided government, do you get much of a sense from either party about what can realistically get done over the next year?
I think expectations should be quite low. Republicans did work with Joe Biden on some things for the first couple of years, but very quickly attention will turn to 2024 and they will not want to give him many wins. Republicans now control the House. We've obviously heard a lot already about how they're planning all kinds of investigations into Anthony Fauci and coronavirus, into Joe Biden's son Hunter, to the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I fear that will use up a lot of time and oxygen, and a lot of Joe Biden's attention will have to be on judicial and administrative nominees that he can still get through the Senate as Democrats control that, and also maybe focusing more on foreign policy too. I think historically, when you look at presidencies, they do tend to do badly in their first midterm. And they do tend to have their real signature achievement in their first couple of years, whether it's Obama with healthcare or Trump with taxes. So even though Joe Biden likes to work across the aisle and has had some success with that, I suspect a Republican Party where Marjorie Taylor Greene is a loud voice is going to make it very difficult, is going to lead to lots of gridlock and frustration, and is just going to feed that in a kind of feedback loop, is going to contribute to that narrative that Washington is, doesn't get much done and needs an outsider to blow it up again.
Until about 10 years ago, when I left Washington, it seemed like the city was still something of a polite town, regardless of your political nature, that after hours or at White House parties, there was still a certain collegiality among lawmakers and politicians. And then a lot of people say that changed during the Trump administration. There was a certain sort of meanness that came into Washington. Has that meanness receded a little bit, or is it still a very, very partisan place?
It's certainly a lot more partisan than it was 20 or 30 years ago. You hear from old timers, and again, some of those extremists like Marjorie Taylor Greene are steering that. They contributing to a culture where some members of Congress feel their safety is threatened, that there could be violence. And of course, we saw the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul, in San Francisco a few months ago. So yeah, I think there are moments where senators of both parties get together, and it's a glimpse of the old days. But in general, you don't have that same culture of people staying late, dining together. They tend to scurry off back to their constituencies, and it's going to take another significant shift, I think, to get back to the golden days of bipartisanship.
Well, speaking of days, we're only 13 months until the first presidential primaries and caucuses in the 2024 campaign. So it's going to be an interesting ramp up to that. David Smith, Washington bureau chief of The Guardian. David, thanks for doing this. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
You got it. And that'll do it for this conversation. On behalf of Asher Cofield, Gina Kim, Craig Lowry, Bart Kyle, and the entire team at the Young Turks, I'm David Schuster. Thanks for watching.